So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Kimberly Tyden. I'm the Henry J. Lair Professor in International Humanitarian Studies here at the Fletcher School. And let me turn up my volume a little. As we began to plan this panel, there was a phrase that just kept running through my head. Pride is an action verb. It's an active verb. It's not just 1 month. Pride is something we feel, something we are, something that we do, something we put into practice to bring about change in this world. So the title for our webinar today is precisely that, Putting Pride into Practice, a Fletcher community event. So welcome. The Gender and Intersectional Analysis program, Gaia, here at Fletcher is delighted to bring us together and to feature some of our current students and alumni. So a moment of boasting, of course, because pride is also, you can have some boasting sometimes. We stand out among the APSIA schools, so those schools designed to train professionals for careers in international affairs, because we move beyond the tenacious binary variables in which too much energy and effort is mired. When gender is code for women and girls, someone and something is missing. Now, there is the occasional mention of men and boys before they lapse back into the women and girls. It's not even hyphenated to women and girls. Focus. Focus. How some people and topics are brought into our range of vision while others are obscured. These binaries in no way capture the broad spectrum of gendered identities that shape our lives, desires, goals, and experiences in this world. In addition, then, to our insistence on a broad spectrum of gendered identities, at Gaia, we foreground intersectionality. We are all an amalgam of multiple identities, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religious commitments. We explore the intersection, the points of convergence of these many identities to grasp how they confer privilege to some and the accumulation of structural disadvantage to others. Now, in one of her many brilliant lectures, Kimberly Crenshaw asks people in the audience to ask themselves some questions. So when we look at something, do we see the racism in it? Good. Do you see the sexism in it? Even better. But what about the homophobia, the transphobia, the able-bodied assumptions, the ageism? What do we see and what do we not? Are we seeing life in all of its complexity? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns us against the danger of a simple story. As she eloquently argues, the single or simple story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they aren't true, but they're incomplete. They make one story the only story. And we are all much more than just one story. If we can hear these intersecting stories, perhaps we can develop more humane, compassionate, and effective policies, programs, and perhaps construct more equitable societies. So Gaia aims to do that by training the next generation of scholars, practitioners, and leaders to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion by bringing a gender and intersectional lens to research, policy, and politics. So now you get to hear from some of our current students and alumni. I want to turn it over to my co-host, Nicholas Ciccinelli. Nicholas is one of our stellar Gaia doctoral students, active in the Fletcher community and with such important research. Listen to the title. His dissertation is Illegible Identities, Invisible Harms, Investigating Refugee Status Determination Processes and Protection Outcomes for Sexual and Gender Minority Asylum Seekers in the United States. Nicholas, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tyden, for your opening remarks and for that introduction and for facilitating what I hope will be a really engaging and fascinating conversation. I have, I think, the best part of this conversation, which is introducing the panelists. And exactly like you said, pride is inherently interdisciplinary and intersectional, and it also has to be intentional in its work to remedy the structural barriers that we're about to discuss. And I think that's really embodied in the work of the panels that we have. So I'll start with Pedro Cardenas, who's a 2019 graduate of the Fletcher Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy, which we call the MALD. And Pedro is currently, and also a good friend. It's really nice to see you back, Pedro, even digitally. He is currently the case documentation and follow-up coordinator at Article 19's Mexico and Central America office, where his work is dedicated to the protection of the press and human rights activists in Mexico and across Latin America. That involves documenting human rights violations, political advocacy, legal analysis. It's no small order. Prior to Fletcher and Article 19, Pedro has been with Peace Brigades International, accompanying human rights defenders in Guatemala. He's been an international business representative, a teacher, a volunteer supporting the families of the disappeared in Mexico. He's got quite a range of experiences, so I'm excited to hear from him. And next we have Katie Constantidis. I practiced that and messed it up. I'm sorry, Katie. Who's a rising second-year MALD student studying gender analysis and human security with us at the Fletcher School. She's also a recent graduate of the University of Denver, where she has a background in international studies, of course, and gender and women's studies. Currently, for this summer, she's a gender equality fellow at Save the Children, working to support the creation of gender-sensitive and transformative programming. She's also a co-leader of Pride at Fletcher and an editor for the Praxis Journal of Human Security, as well as planning one of my favorite Fletcher events, which is the Conference on Gender and International Affairs. Also, no shortage of CV, very busy as well. In Katie's research, she's passionate about using feminist and queer theory to analyze and subvert international norms and systems of power, and focuses on the importance of bringing local community perspectives to the study and practice of IR. Another co-leader of Pride at Fletcher is Mitchell, our third panelist, who's another rising second-year MALD student at Fletcher, studying gender and intersectional analysis, as well as international negotiation and conflict resolution. He's a recent graduate of Centre College, where he studied international relations and Spanish. Prior to that, he was a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Paraguay. And in addition to Pride at Fletcher, he's a representative of the Fletcher Student Council. And Mitchell's interests in particular lie with the transitional justice field, centering the international, state, and local provisions that are afforded to gender and sexual minorities in conflict and post-conflict environments. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'll send it back over to Professor Tyden for our first prompt.
Wonderful. So good to see everybody. I'll be glad to be back in the classroom. I miss everybody. So there's a broad question, but I think you all have so much to say about it. How has gender, intersectionality, and pride influenced your research, your work, and your advocacy? Whoever feels like they'd like to go first.
I mean, for me, it's my entire life. I like to joke that I've made a career around being an angry queer feminist. It's just everything I do. I've been really passionate about gender studies since I started in undergrad. I kind of fell into it. And then as I sort of grew into my identity as a queer person, that has really guided my research interests and my career interests as well. Because I just feel very strongly that this is a community that is deeply underrepresented in IR. And there needs to be more of us, both just as a presence, like more queer bodies in IR and also more queer perspectives, because those are sometimes two different things. So yeah, it plays into everything I do. Every paper I write has a gender lens. My internship this summer is focused on being in the gender equality team. So it's really, it means a lot to me personally as well as professionally.
And we're going to come back around with some questions following up. I want now to turn to Mitchell and Pedro, but to come back certainly to Katie, who wrote a really powerful piece for Gaia's inaugural newsletter on queering IR. So we'll come back around. Mitchell, Pedro, who'd like to go next?
I can go next. I think how I sort of made my first foray into gender and intersectional analysis, like Katie said, kind of came from lived experience. And in my undergrad, I focused more on international development. And one of the first sort of classes that was specifically focused on gender was my gender and international development course. And as you said towards the beginning, when we talk about gender, it's very women and children. And there is some mention, of men or boys. And that was my first introduction. And because of my lived experience as a queer person, I sort of dipped my toes into the water with that course and then said, okay, where am I and where are we in this field, both theoretically and practically? And, in the past few years, you can see a larger inclusion and visibility of queer people in roles, but that doesn't necessarily translate to queer people in policy and theory and the structural scaffolding for the roles that they inhabit. And so that's really what has led me to focus more specifically and more intentionally on gender and intersectional analysis, because to put it frankly, we deserve a place at the table as well when it comes to policy formation, when it comes to theory, and when it comes to research. Quite honestly, I did not know much about queer theory at all until graduate school, but a lot of when I approached it, a lot of it really felt familiar because it felt like, okay, well, I've lived some of this. I kind of understand where this is coming from in terms of not really complicating binaries and working through what power means and what structure means in that patriarchal sense, in the heteronormative sense, and in the cisnormative sense.
Wonderful. Thank you. Pedro?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. Well, for me, I realized that for a long time in my life, I compartmentalized between my personal life and my professional life. It's very interesting because working in human rights, I was in an area where, quite opposite to many others' experiences, my work is actually my safe space in terms of it makes sense. We're going to document human rights violations against women, against children, against men, against the LGBTQ community. How does it change? How does it happen? So to me, it was a very theoretical and very logical aspect of life that I've been working on for several years now. But my personal life, on the other hand, was very restricted. And that probably has to do, with how the situation is legally, politically, and socially in Mexico. For those of you, that I have the pleasure of meeting, I'm from Mexico, and I live in Mexico now. And my personal life always felt like I cannot come out of the closet. I cannot be so open about this. So while I was very open and very public about protecting LGBT rights at work, with my own family, with my own living spaces, particularly, right now I work in Mexico City, which is completely open. Coming from other cities that are more conservative, I actually felt unsafe within other spaces. So for me, the experience of making pride a verb and the experience of doing this is realizing how connected these two are, and how, my whole process of self-acceptance and opening these spaces within my own family and within, conservative spaces in Mexico actually are matched to the struggle for human rights and the actual protection and risk assessment methodologies that we work every day.
Yeah. I'm hearing you say something, and I was going to save this dreary statistic to later, but as we know, there are 76 countries in the world that outlaw all same-sex relationships at all. So as we start to think about the challenges of work and of life, it's also thinking about where we are from, where we live, and what it means to live in a country in which your very being is criminalized, right? Consensual, doesn't matter, it's criminalized. And so we hopefully will perhaps come back to that and what it means for people. And it's very powerful what you were saying. Katie, you wrote a great piece on queering IR. And for people who perhaps aren't as familiar with the idea of queering things, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's something that it feels like a big, scary thing. And a lot of queer theorists are notably obtuse. I'm looking at you, Judith Butler. But we love them all the same. But queering something is really just to see beyond the binary of it. The easiest way to look at it is you queer gender. We think of, you have men and women, but there are non-binary people and third gender people and two-spirit people, and folks all over the world who don't fit into this binary. And so to queer gender, it just means there's more than two. An example I like to think of from international studies is the dichotomy of developing and underdeveloped, developed and underdeveloped, because what does that mean? Is there there's like some invisible marker that we use, because every country is really along a spectrum. And then we also have to ask, when you queer that dichotomy, you have to ask, who is setting the terms for what it means to be developed? What are the standards? Who are setting those standards? Queering something really just means interrogating it on not just asking questions about it, but asking yourself why you're asking those questions. So it's taking it kind of a step further. If that was clear at all and makes sense.
Oh, it's really clear. And please, everyone else, feel free to jump in. Now, what I love is that it goes back to something all of you have touched upon, which is this is about power. So when you think about those hierarchies, we all know them. It's women, men, boys, but it's also nature, culture, science, superstition, reason, affect. I mean, these binaries are steeped in such histories, right? Of colonialism, of conquest, of settler colonialism, of capitalism. So they don't help us think differently about things. And so what I appreciate about the article that you wrote and what others have been saying on this panel is queering is an intrinsically political act also. It is about saying when something is presented to us as natural, who said? How did it come to be the natural? How often has natural and unnatural sex acts was code word for any sort of quote, gay or same-sex relationships. So this category of the unnatural has been used to cast people as deviant and also to present nature as this sort of inert resource for people to be exploiting. So when I think about queering things, it's really, as you said, Katie, it's just about moving beyond binaries, but also to ask, why is this given this way? Whose purpose, whose greater goals are served by us all thinking this is just the way it is, to put it colloquially? So I really appreciate you raising that. Does anybody else want to say something else about the queering? Because I think it's just.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
This is my thing. I also sometimes like to think about it as it's not necessarily seeing things differently or as they aren't or in a new way. It's a lot of times seeing things as they actually are. Because, for example, we have this constructed binary of sex, male and female. And we're never taught about intersex folks who are a significant part of the population. Sex is not binary. You have chromosomes, you have external characteristics, you have hormonal characteristics. That's different for every person. There is this binary we've constructed. It's exactly that, it's constructed. So queering something isn't always making something new, it's seeing things as they always were. But we're forced into these boxes. Yeah.
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. Because in the gender class, we always start with the notion that we've been told that there's this biological foundation from which all the rest in this binary elaborates. And that's why I think we try so hard to begin with the fact that a whole lot of people in the world are born. It's pretty ambivalent. It's very ambiguous. And do you have a doctor making a judgment call right there that sends somebody off on some kind of binary trajectory that has nothing to do with how they feel at all? So I think this is a really important point. Biology is not the bedrock that one might want to, believe it to be at times. So going back to some of the other things that you've raised, Pedro, I'm really interested in how it was to live compartmentalized. Do you feel that that is less a part of your life now, that there's a closer a crossover of the work that you do and the life that you lead outside of your workplace? I'm just curious if that's not too personal a question.
No, definitely. I mean, absolutely. I think for me, my whole trajectory has been about more and more realizing how these two fit together. It's sort of the idea that I'm currently working in human rights and currently working in freedom of expression, you start realizing that freedom of expression has been limited not only by the traditional ideas of, political censorship, which we all know, but also there is an additional censorship that happens to people within the LGBTQ community that is, well, first of all, you cannot express yourself, in other definitions of the term, but think about it from a human rights perspective, the right to political participation, your right to assembly, your right to a private life, all of these end up intertwining. And then for me, it was sort of like, you know what? Yeah, I mean, I am fighting for this rights because I want to live it. And because I know people deserve to live no matter what. And, speaking of intersectionalities, while I am part of the LGBTQ community, I also need to understand that I'm very privileged in others. Thinking about intersectionality, it's not the same to be living in an urban area, to be living in the capital like Mexico City, than to be living outside. It's not the same to have a higher economic status where you can be independent by yourself and just, yes, I can separate from, for instance, while it's not my case, it can be many cases within Mexico that, I have to separate from my family because my family itself is a danger to me, particularly for the trans community in Mexico. And in the end, work ends up sort of realizing this kind of things. And, I can talk about this very briefly with one case that we documented very recently, which was a trans journalist that was covering the Women's Rights March. She was actually attacked while she was recording a conservative feminist group. So she was attacked by cisgendered women. And the journalists, they told me like, hey, I don't understand, is this attack coming because I'm a journalist or because I'm trans? And I'm like, it's both. There is an intersectionality that puts people at risk, and that the system has made people vulnerable, even though they shouldn't be. And in that regard, you have to realize that everything is connected, and that this work sort of realizes and recognizes a lot of what Katie was saying. You cannot just see it as a binary. You cannot just say like, oh yeah, you were attacked because you're a journalist, you being trans has nothing to do with it, or even the other way around. No, you were attacked because you're a trans woman, you being a journalist has nothing to do with it. And it really, that makes no sense, and it has never made sense. But how we generate protections for the population overall, it's actually something that you can identify and understand that, your life is political, whether you want to or not.
Really important points. Mitchell, do you want to jump in a little bit more? I'm thinking about some of the wonderful, like your finale that you wrote in one of the classes, and your reflection on urban and rural and where people can move and sort of spatialized imaginaries. I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that, because that was such a thoughtful finale, we call them.
Sure. Actually, hearing Pedro's sort of narrative about moving from a more rural area of Mexico to an urban area resonated with me. I mean, I don't want to elide our lived experiences at all, but I'm from Kentucky. I'm from a very, rural part of the United States, the flyover states, or Middle America. And, I've grown up in the foothills of Appalachia, and moving from there to Boston is, night and day when it comes to visibility and queerness and what it means to have a comfort in a public space. But I think, at the same time, queerness is very nuanced when it comes to how we are understanding the personal expression of it. And so in the paper that Professor Tyden mentioned, I wanted to explore popular understandings of queerness when it comes to rural and urban spaces, and how in many times, or in many instances in popular culture, when we think about maybe mainstreaming queerness or LGBTI visibility, the rurality or rural areas are situated as sources of trauma inherently, instead of, occasionally or contextually. And the urban center is a liberatory space. And so it inherently is creating a binary in itself when we think about visibility, because using Robert Nixon's terminology, we're unimagining what rural queerness could be. And it's not that there aren't queer people that live in Appalachia, and there are many queer people that live in Appalachia who don't want to move to a big city. You know, it's their queerness and their lived experience is as valid as someone who does move to an urban area. You know, as I said, I resonate with Pedro's narrative because that is, you know, I'm exploring queerness in an academic setting because I wouldn't be able to do that in where I'm from in the same manner. And that is a reality, but there are other realities. And so it sort of towards the end of that paper, I sort of talked about queering queerness in a way, as we sort of mainstream what it looks like to be queer or what experiences are. And you know, I think a lot of this has to do with the heterosexual gaze onto queerness. I think if we buy into the notion that things are a binary, despite our lived experience proving to the contrary, I think it adds to this palatability or prescriptive identity that is reductive ultimately. If we can't push against that when it comes to expanding popular and mainstream understandings of lived experiences and queer identities. And something that Pedro had talked about really resonated with me in terms of his example of the trans journalist. I think, you know, queerness and feminism can go hand in hand, but they don't always go hand in hand. And I think that's a really important thing that we've talked about in, you know, in gender theory, is that, you know, intersectionality is important precisely because feminism as a method of critique and a modicum of understanding the world can also be exclusionary if it is not intentional in including queerness, including a lens that is intersectional for gender identity, for sexual orientation, and for race. I thought that was a really potent example of why it matters, even within these, you know, movements or schools of thought that are purportedly progressive, if we want to use that word. It's kind of charged, but you know, I think I just thought I would mention that.
Nicholas, do you want to jump in here? I'm thinking a bit about some of your work that's so powerful also is about the assumptions of how one must present as a gay person in order to achieve asylum. And all of the assumptions, and yeah, I go back, that's why I love Adichie's idea of the simple story, right? So, you know, so there's this, well, where's the universal gay performance that you have to come up with in order to get the asylum judge or lawyer, whatever, to understand that you're gay? I mean, do you want to say a bit more about that? Because I think it's powerful and it speaks to the conversation here really well.
I think that's perfect timing. I was thinking, as each of you were speaking, about this thread of not only intersection, but collusion among the oppressive forces, where you can have intersecting identities that are made marginal, and as they stack up along these axes of identity, the harms that are perpetuated and multiplied, it can feel insurmountable, and you can fall into a sort of despair. And so I'm thinking about the ways that you have to overcome that in coalition, and how it's not just one narrative working on its own. It's not like it's patriarchy in a vacuum. There are certain masculinities that are privileged over others. There's a race element, a class element. Not all women are inherently good allies or feminists. You know, you have women who are loyal to a certain class structure or power hierarchy that benefits them, and they can marginalize other women. Or this happens infamously in the queer community, where you have cisgender people, able-bodied people, white people, rich people, you know, marginalizing others to sort of buffer themselves from the larger oppressions or to reap benefits. And like you said, Professor Tyden, that happens in the immigration system and the asylum processes as well, where someone by definition is having to comport to a certain very prescribed, very strictly delineated legal category, and make their experiences and their identities legible to someone who has oftentimes insufficient or even no background and no literacy in understanding that. And it's very subjective, but I try and think back to those coalitions that help overcome that. And I wanted to turn it back to each of you three panelists and ask, where do you find those coalitions and effective allyship? I'm thinking, Pedro, about, journalists and the queer community, and oftentimes the people who don't want to make space for free expression in terms of sexuality and gender identity also aren't big supporters of free inquiry or free press. Or Mitchell, in the development world, you have the colonialism and the sort of patriarchal and patronizing lens. And Katie, of course, with a background in gender studies, I know that you think about this often. So if you could each talk about where that shows up in your work and where you look for those alliances and those coalitions, I think that would give me some hope.
Yeah, well, you mentioned me first, so I'm gonna go ahead and speak. I think one important aspect to realize is that LGBT rights, like any other human right, are interdependent. The idea that you can have as a single human right and then you can choose one over the other does not match. And one example that I want to give of a great alliance is with the Right to Access to Information team that we have in Article 19, Mexico. And this very peculiar thing happened in the state of Yucatan. Basically, the state of Yucatan both voted on right to LGBT marriage, of course, same-sex couples. And they decided to apply a security law that, because of national security, very few instances, Congress has a right to vote in secret. And they applied this to the same-sex couples voting. And basically they voted in secret and they just said, nope, it didn't pass. I'm sorry, the state of Yucatan, you cannot get married. So Mexico is a federation, it depends on states. Out of 32, already 21 states have accepted it. There's still some fight to go on, but Yucatan is one of them. And precisely last year, they voted in secret. And they said, nope, it didn't pass. So LGBT rights started saying, how is my decision to marry national security? And how does this affect other rights? And they actually started a huge platform on, hey, this cannot happen. And that's when we realized, like, what do you mean they voted in secret? So the Article 19 team on access to information got together with LGBTQ rights organizations, and we together set up a recourse against the court. And now the court is going to be deciding this very soon on whether it was legal or not for the state of Yucatan to vote this, which of course it isn't. There's no way they can. But we're hoping the Supreme Court of Mexico will decide in favor that, transparency is a human right for everybody, including the LGBT community, because we're not a national security risk. And whether we get married or not is not going to put anybody at risk. And it's actually, the idea that right to access to information can affect some communities more than others is very interesting, and you can see it right away. And it's within this understanding of this codependence of everybody that you have organizations like Article 19 and freedom of expression getting together with LGBTQ rights organizations, getting together with indigenous communities, organizations for other types of rights, and so on and so forth. So this is where we realize it, there's interdependence on everything that we do, and all our human rights cannot be worked just by themselves. So I think that's a pretty happy example. I mean, I'm just very happy that the court took our case. So we'll see how it goes, but I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, I guess on a more personal level, I find a lot of solidarity and community with other queer people, especially other trans people. That is kind of anytime I meet another like non-binary or trans person in IR, it's kind of like a really great moment because there's not a lot of us. Also just having friends I made a really good group of friends in college who also studied gender. So they were all really amazing allies to me in my life. And also in this work, I know quite a few people who do really similar things to me. We're all kind of trying to apply this gender lens in this space and move forward with that, even though it's really difficult. So that's been really great. Professionally, it's been really wonderful working on a team this summer that is the like gender equality team. They've all been amazing. They have an intersectional lens. And they're also really great about forming networks of solidarity with other people within the organization, with queer organizations, and just trying to make those networks is really important. I think also at Fletcher with other affinity groups, that's something I personally want to do more with in Pride, is making those connections and solidarity with them, because like Pedro mentioned, it's all interconnected. We are all facing the same system in different ways, and it affects us each differently, and it layers onto us differently. But at the end of the day, it is all interconnected, and none of us is free until all of us is free. So just finding those solidarity with folks and making friends with other queer people is really heartening and helps me get through the day.
Can I just say one thing? Someone sent me earlier today something, you made me think about it, Katie. When you talk about how few of us, queer folks in IR, and someone said, can we just stop talking about underrepresented groups and say that they've been historically excluded? And I thought, oh, that's, yeah, because underrepresented sounds like there's no agent, there's no protagonist of this. You don't know how it happened. It erases all agency as opposed to a historically excluded. Like, who do you not see on the canon? Who digs in deep and does not want to change the syllabi, all of these sorts of things. So I found that I'm really going to insist on that language of the historically excluded. I want to look at the fact that this has happened. There's been, I don't want to say perpetrator, it's kind of tempting, but that there have been groups that have actively been excluding them. So let's try to figure out who those groups are instead of this innocuous underrepresented without any sort of historical or agency to it. So it's really powerful what you said. Mitchell, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, because I think my answer is very similar to Katie's, and that I've been very fortunate to have a community of friends and peers who do work that's very similar to me. And so, you know, having that community has been really gratifying, you know, as someone in school, but also just a person who sometimes takes their work home with them when it comes to understanding, you know, myself in the world. But I think one thing that maybe, or an outlet that I've found to be really useful, and I guess it might be a product of me being a millennial and unfortunately very online, capital V, capital O, or the fact that we've been in a pandemic and secluded and cloistered in our bedrooms. But I think that, you know, virtual spaces, especially for queer people, are so important when it comes to understanding each other, creating community, and also sharing work and sharing opinions and sharing experiences. And so, you know, I've found that being able to understand people through, I mean, platforms like Twitter or Reddit are really useful, because it gives you a global perspective that you may not get. I mean, especially during a pandemic, you're not going to get it. And so that's really influenced how I understand queerness and decoloniality and transitional justice, because I've been able to search for scholars who work on these issues, but also people who are, I don't want to use the term frontlines, but people who experience these issues every day. And I think that is also an important part of community, as people who are in academia, sort of descending from the ivory tower and understanding queerness, not from 30,000 feet, because I think it's easy to inform your studies by your lived experience, but that is also a bit narrow when it comes to when you approach academia. And so if you're not informing it from the ground level and from a grassroots perspective, which inherently I think is why community is so beneficial, because it grounds you. I mean, I don't think there's any other word for it other than grounding you. I find that super, super helpful.
I was thinking it's also, I mean, to my mind, it's also part of whether one likes the term self-care, whatever term one wants to use, it's people who get it, right? Where you don't have to constantly be explaining yourself, right? And who understand it. Because I'm thinking, Pedro, you were talking earlier about how emotionally challenging some of this protection work is in Mexico. And that sometimes you just are overwhelmed by it. And that's when you want to be able to turn to someone who gets it and can be supportive and have that kind of network of people around you. And I find that that's been really important for me as well, both just my own, like my personal life, but also I work on violence. And when I need to have people who I don't have to start with them looking at me, go, oh, you work on what? That is not that just doesn't ever feel really supportive to me. So it's like, I want someone who understands the baseline and I don't have to get them up to speed on it. And so I'm really hearing a lot of that. One thing that occurs to me, and Nicholas, if you want to jump in with another question, but one thing that does occur to me, early on when I started teaching at Fletcher, sometimes, I would have students come to my office hours and they'd say, we really want to participate more in class, but we're probably going to offend somebody. What language do you learn? What terms do you use? And so I started having someone from the LGBTQ Center, Hope Freeman, who's absolutely fabulous, come over. Let's just put all these terms out so that people, but my point is the following: folks wanted to be allies. They wanted to make sure they didn't offend anybody, but so they didn't say anything because they were really, and especially like some international students, maybe they come from some country where, you don't, what are the terms you use in English to talk with people and be respectful? So I'm curious, what does allyship look for you? Like when you think about the areas of your life in which you work, live, what have you, move, what if there's some sensitive, caring folks out there listening to this saying, well, God, I don't know what to do. What can I do? Give me some tools that would be helpful. What are some of those? I think people want actionable, what can we do kinds of suggestions sometimes, I'm curious if you have some ideas on that we can share with the folks who are on the webinar today.
For me, it's listen to us, but also do your own research. When your lived identity and experience is so deeply tied to your work, it's exhausting on a lot of levels. And then when you have to take that work to your personal spaces as well, it can be a lot. Like if someone I'm close to has a question or wants me to explain something, that's something that I'm happy to explain. But I've had a lot of just like kind of invasive, unnecessary questions from people who don't know me well. And it's really just, it's not my job to educate you on what my pronouns mean. And there is definitely like knowing where you're at with a person is really important. And asking permission before you ask a question that might be a lot for someone to explain, and it might not feel like a lot to explain, but for us it is sometimes. So definitely doing your own research is amazing. There's a lot of great books and things by queer people out there to read and look at. So just taking time to do that is amazing. And also just listening to us and respecting what we say instead of asking us to justify it. I've had a lot of conversations where I'm, saying my pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And the amount of times someone has said to me, well, they, them is confusing to me because to me it means more than one person. I've heard that 100 times and I just don't care anymore. Like that's on you, that's your problem. It's not, I don't need you to make excuses for why it's hard for you. I just need you to do it. And if you mess up, it's okay, but say thank you when you're corrected, and to not make it about you. Because at the end of the day, you being uncomfortable because you said something offensive is a lot easier than being misgendered. So just being respectful of our experiences and educating yourself and giving your money and time to queer people, especially queer people of color. That's like putting your resources where your mouth is really important as well.
I think to Katie's point, one of the things that I really sat with last year with the movement for racial justice across the US, as I practice being an ally in other aspects for other identities, is the sort of a simple test of, am I taking space and am I making space? And I think that is really important, as Katie is saying, when it comes to voices that are being almost demanded, demanded that they speak on behalf of an entire population, on behalf of entire identity. The emotional, the mental, the financial sometimes toll that can take on people is awful. And I think, you know, centering your own education when it comes to relying on marginalized voices for that education it can be problematic, you know. And I think, as Katie was saying, it really does matter the degree to which you are comfortable with this person and this person is comfortable with you when you come to them with questions, because, you know, I mean, I think I'm just reiterating a lot of what Katie said, but, you know, we don't live to be teachers. And if we are, I mean, I think that is such a big problem, and that Katie raises, compensation. You know, marginalized voices, the word is right there, marginalized. You know, there are people who aren't getting high profile book deals to talk about their lived experience. They are probably people who are grassroots, online, in virtual spaces. Those virtual spaces, as I sort of talked about before, are great communities for learning and for understanding in a way that is can be less intrusive for queer people or people of other marginalized identities. And so, yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add to that. I guess the only thing is, impact is defined by each individual. And I speak of that in the sense that, you know, Katie was saying it. I believe that, you know, the same law can affect you different ways depending on your identity. And I think that's an ally understands that, because, you know, I've had the opportunity of, you know, being part of the marginalized community that has been affected, but also being part of being an allyship to other communities, which I do not belong to, who have also been marginalized, even if we share a little bit of not or not of our identities. And for me, the one thing that, you know, identifies a good ally is that they understand that the same law, the same threat, the same action will affect people differently, and you don't get to decide or judge if that is correct or not. It's the people that are telling you, this is dangerous to me, this is problematic for me, that you need to understand the conversation in the sense of stepping back and understanding why first. And I think that's a big thing, you know, even, you know, when I see it, even from my work perspective, the same threat, you know, imagine a scenario where a journalist gets a threat. It is not the same to have, you know, the same threat by the same actor, by the same aggressor, can have very different repercussions emotionally, physically, economically on, you know, a journalist who's a mother of two, on an indigenous man living in, you know, a rural area, on someone that is part of the LGBT community and doesn't have a family that supports him or her or them. In that sense, you know, it's when somebody tells you that something is off, the first question you need to ask to yourself, you know, like we were saying, not necessarily to charge on them, but is why and how is this affecting differently to how it affects me? Because it will, and it's an important aspect to decide.
I really appreciate what you were all saying. First of all, it's like, who is tasked with helping other people unlearn their racism, sexism, transphobia? It's exhausting. So can everybody go out and kind of do their work on these issues? And I also think, like, who is tasked with explaining themselves, and who gets to move through the world? And the question's just never asked. They're not in a marked category. They're not asked to explain themselves over and over again. And so I do think allyship is also people, as you've said, all of you eloquently, do the work. If you don't understand it, well, there's probably something you can read, some online source, some virtual space. There are probably some resources, instead of always tasking people, right, with explaining themselves and having to do it over and over again, because it is exhausting. One of the questions here, given that queer people have been historically excluded from the IR field, how do you navigate being an ambassador with a ha-ha of your own identity in the field. I want to make sure I just put that on the table in case somebody would like to speak to it.
I think part of it in how I approach my classroom experience at Fletcher is that there's no classroom where queerness is not necessarily relevant. And so, you know, asking those questions in classes, whether it be in a finance class, whether it be in, you know, development econ, whether it's in security studies, those fields are all related to queerness and queer people, because there are queer people in those fields, whether or not they are producing scholarship, whether or not they are a person who conceals their identity or lives openly in a role at the Department of Defense, in the nonprofit sector. Queer people are everywhere and they're in every field. So why limit it to a gender studies classroom? Why limit it to, you know, these very defined spaces when it comes to understanding queerness, or when we sort of grapple with queerness in a safe way? And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, transparently. You know, going into a class about international humanitarian law and asking, well, what about, you know, transgender people and being detainees in armed conflict? You know, that's not necessarily always, you know, the most comfortable thing, but, you know, in my personal experience, asking those questions gets students who maybe are also queer, or students who are straight and interested, you know, it gets them thinking about it. Yep. And even just asking a simple question plants even just a seed of curiosity in the minds of other people. And that can be, you know, a ripple effect where someone takes that and runs with it in a very, very positive way. And so that's kind of, you know, at least when it comes to the classroom, how I approach it.
Yeah, that's really similar to that. For me, being non-binary, as I have become more visible to myself and in my own identity, I've also seen myself disappear from the work I do, from IR. Something I talk about a little bit in my piece is we are bombarded with like women's empowerment groups and women's this and women's that, and where that is a space I would have been comfortable a few years ago, it's not anymore. And so in just like by being myself and existing as an out non-binary person in IR, I feel like that's the effort, like I'm doing the work, because that is sometimes a really exhausting thing. And I've also just kind of taken it upon myself to be that ambassador for trans folks in IR. And in my classes at Fletcher, just like Mitchell said, asking, even when we talk about gender things, we say, okay, this affects women this way, this affects men this way. And then I have to ask, but what about non-binary people? What about trans people? How is this different for them? How is this different for queer women and queer men? And just kind of poking a little bit and pushing that forward and being very out and very proud of who I am in a public space around people who may not have come into contact with a trans or non-binary person before, is kind of how I try to advocate in my personal life and in my professional life as well.
Yeah, I think I'd like to answer that question on the ambassadorship of your own identity by saying that I haven't always been. And I think, you know, I'm coming this from a work perspective. There are spaces where you know you're safe, and I become an ambassador in those spaces. But there are times where I have decided that I cannot be the ambassador because I myself might be in danger. And, you know, working in Latin America in different countries, even in Mexico, you know, even when talking about rural versus urban, even in the same city, there are locations in Mexico City where, you know, you might be unsafe if you speak out about who you are. You know, socially, not maybe legally we're protected and everything, but even socially, you might not be in this, you know, small places. So I think for me, one thing about handling this is I keep learning. And while I always try to be an ambassador because I know I will open space for others, I think sometimes you need one thing that I would say is that not everyone in the world you're safe to be the ambassador, and that is okay. I think that's something that, from my own perspective, is it's okay. You don't have to carry that burden, and I don't have to carry that burden if I don't feel safe myself. And it's important to, it's okay if in this space I'm like very vocal, very outright gay, and in this space I'm not. And that has to be my own decision and nobody else's.
100% agree, 150%. And I think it's a wonderful set. I'm looking at, we're almost out of time. And Pedro, your comments segue to something that I want to say before we run out of time. I think we'd be remiss to conclude without a heartfelt nod to those who could not join us today. There are some members of our Fletcher community who cannot participate in events of this sort. They cannot have their photos taken if they are at events of this sort for fear of being shunned by their families, discriminated against in their workplaces, or because they wish to return, if only to visit, their countries of origin, and they can't safely do so if they are publicly identified as being a member of the LGBT communities. And that's what I was just saying, 76 countries actively outlaw this LGBTQ identity, but there are others when, even if it's not outlawed, you better not talk about it. So imagine what it's like. So I just want to say to those members of our community who feel, for all of these very good reasons, that their own security means they can't participate, I just want them to know they are in our thoughts and our affections today and always. And we're almost out of time. So in my city, there's no march this year, probably not in yours, but I have these shoes. I'm ready for 2022. Do you see these? There, I am so ready for 2022. I'm all ready to go. But even if we can't march this year, for those of you who are listening either now or subsequently, certainly there are other ways you can stand up and show support. And I suggest, and I'm never good at this, but I'm going to try. I'm going to actually ask you to support our work and our students at Gaia. And it may be, I'm not asking you to open your checkbooks. It may be that you have a parent who can, or a workplace where they might have something they can help support Gaia. So Nicholas, can you show people how easy it is to support our work and to help our students and faculty put pride into practice every day, all year long? It's right there. So do you want to just point it out?
I was going to say, yes, we've just redesigned our website. And what I wanted to highlight in addition is all the different forms our work takes. We have a newsletter that we've just started that will be going out quarterly. We have a blog that features student work like the piece by Katie that we've been discussing. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom of our page is our annual report that highlights all of the different research projects, the advocacy, the inquiry that we're working on. And support and allyship. The financial piece is obviously very important, but we're always looking for collaborators, co-conspirators, fellow investigators. Mm-hmm. It takes, like I said earlier, a broad and diverse coalition. And we're here to support you in the field, in the school, in the university. So please be in touch. And if you are able, the Make a Gift section is right here. Wonderful. In our trademark orange, of course.
So thank you so much. Pedro, Katie, Mitchell, Nicholas, and all of you who have joined us today. We could keep talking for a long, long time because I'm always eager to talk with all of you. But I want to thank you for giving us your time today. And I'm wishing you all the very best. Thank you.